if you know the name of your farmer, you're probably not going to need to know the name of your doctor. And that's because of the clear health impacts and outcomes that you can achieve if you actually put the thought and time into sourcing products out of a regenerative system. What do we actually want with these animals? We want them to be the healthiest animal they possibly can be. One of the main reasons that we use organic beef is because soil testing needs to be done on that organic land 4 years before the organic certification is reached, and that soil testing ensures that there's no harmful pesticide that are found on that land or in that soil.
Welcome to Chief Life, the podcast that cuts the crap with science-backed insights on health, nutrition and performance. Get expert advice, actionable tips and everything you need to take control of your health and live your best life. Let's get started. Today's episode is all about regenerative farming, a term you've probably heard but might not fully understand. We'll chat about the origins of regenerative agriculture, explore how it differs from factory farms, and how it stacks up against organic farming. Brock Hatton is the CEO of Chief Nutrition. Not only does he lead the company, but he's also at the forefront of product development and oversees our international markets. Brock leads our team by example, staying mentally and physically fit while juggling the business and being father of 3. He's very inspirational, and he's also very passionate about the regenerative farming and making the real difference in a health space. Thank you, Brock, and welcome. And thank you so much for making the time in your busy day to chat to us.
Not at all, V. Obviously, always good to chat, and always good to chat about such an important topic and one that I'm clearly passionate about. So looking forward to getting stuck in and hopefully answer some of the questions that people out there have about Regen Ag.
Yeah, it's not just the people, it's even just me. I don't know some of the answers, and I should, because as our listeners know, all the meat we use in Chief is regeneratively farmed, and it's also organic and grass-fed and grass-finished. So I think I know this, but our listeners probably don't know what exactly is regenerative farming. The word has been tossed around a lot. And as I said, our customers are aware our meat is regeneratively farmed, but what does it really mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it often gets lost or misinterpreted as to its real meaning. And, I think for me and for us, it's about making sure that we are contributing to the environment, hopefully building soil structure, looking at a number of different environmental impacts, I guess, of the creation and grazing of the animals. And so for us, I look at regen as being able to be positively contributing to the environment in which our animals are raised, as well as being able to contribute to the community in which they're raised as well. So I think certainly it's important to look at the environmental factors, look at, are we making sure that we're not clearing land, making sure that we're using adequate amounts of just natural waterfall and not looking at irrigated areas. But most importantly, we want to be contributing to the environment and to the community in which we're part of.
Amazing. And so do you know when and how did regenerative farming originate?
So, it's interesting because it's actually going back to an older way of working, right? Like, I think if we looked at the evolution of agriculture and the way in which it evolved as part of humankind, I think it's actually a return to these types of principles, which is working with the land rather than against the land, right? So it's in terms of its renaissance or its ability to come back into vogue or being utilized, I think there's been a lot of people that have contributed to that. Certainly Alan Savory, I think, is a pioneer in that and has done amazing things in terms of, building the idea of regen and what can be done with it. I think Joel Salatin in the US as well. So there's been a lot of people, throughout, I guess, the 60s, 70s, and through to today that did amazing things in terms of building on the ideas, but essentially it is that kind of old way of farming, right? Pre-industrial revolution and pre-industrialized farming methodologies. This is the way that we worked with our land, right? We didn't clear grasslands and look at setting up irrigation and these types of things. We weren't monocropping. We weren't utilizing these types of farming methodologies. It was actually much more around working with the landscape and being a custodian of that landscape. And so in my eyes, it's actually a return to these types of principles. Obviously a lot of the information I'm going to give you today is still not from a farmer's perspective, so I hope I do them justice. But, that in my eyes, it's really a return to this idea of getting out of nature's way and working with it rather than sort of battling it and some of the climactic events that we see.
Amazing. So let's start with the most simplest but interesting question for those who have no idea. Can you please outline the main differences between factory and regenerative farms?
Yeah, so look, farm. I kind of touched on it earlier, right? The whole idea of industrialized farming is that you will essentially you're looking at the creation of beef or chicken or whatever the monocropped or mono or singular sort of output is, and essentially just trying to maximize the outputs as much as you can, right? And it's to the detriment of nature. And so what industrialized farming does is that it'll take over a particular environment. Often that's cleared land. If we're talking about on a global footprint, we're seeing a lot of that happen in South America, in Brazil. Forests are being cleared and industrialized farming processes are being moved in, right? And so that's not just beef, it's everything, right? So monocropped soy crops and wheat, canola, whatever it might be, right? I think that's the idea of an industrialized process, is that you are doing one thing singularly and you are trying to eradicate everything else, right? And so that's the same for livestock management. Essentially, a lot of the industrialized methods are essentially trying to kill a lot of things. So they're trying to kill the bugs, they're trying to kill the fungicides and the pests that come in using pesticides, and they're essentially eliminating biodiversity. And so the difference with what Regen Ag tries to do is obviously with soil at its core and is trying to build that biodiversity level and the organic matter which is found within that soil, which is so important. And that flows through into everything. And most importantly, it flows through into the produce which is created and ultimately the produce which is consumed by us as humans. And so when we look at these sort of concepts, what do we want when we're looking at our food systems? We want high levels of biodiversity. We want these elements that, you as a nutritionist would recognize this, I think, V, is that, the soil structure is not dissimilar, I guess, to the gut microbiome, right? We're looking at making sure that we have all of this wonderful diversity within that soil structure or within the microbiome of the gut. And we're looking to make sure that it's properly balanced and doing it in a right way. I think that's often sort of missed, and I think that's what we're trying to really get to the heart of with Regen, is making sure that we have a healthy food system, not just for the system itself, but obviously for the consumers of those foods, which are us.
Yeah, you explained it very well. I love the comparison to the gut. It's really cool. I never thought of it like that. So is there any difference? And if there is, what is the difference between the meat from factories and from regenerative farms?
Yeah, well, I think for me, and look, you have to be really careful around the way in which you sort of talk to these different food systems, and none of them are going going to be the same. Looking at a grass-fed animal in Australia versus in America is going to be completely different. Even a grass-fed animal in Channel country of Australia versus the Southern Highlands of Australia is going to have different sort of vitamin and mineral contents. But what we see is really just that health of the animal. So, we talk about what is a factory farmed or an industrialized animal fed at a feedlot. Often, certainly in North America, it's going to be corn or corn derivatives. It's going to be these types of grains which are not necessarily the best for the animal, and certainly not what animals have necessarily evolved to eat. These ruminants, obviously they have these multiple stomachs which do a really good job of converting essentially grass into high protein muscle, which we use as beef. But it's very different what that animal will essentially build in their muscle in terms of nutrients and vitamins and minerals in a grass-fed environment compared to a corn or a grain-fed animal. And so often, people talk about the mix of the omega-3s and omega-6s. That's certainly one part of it. But I think if you think about it holistically, what do we actually want with these animals? We want them to be the healthiest animal they possibly can be, right? And I think, again, if we get back to nature, what have they evolved to do? They've evolved to eat grasses, largely from grasslands, and convert that food into high protein, nutrient dense beef. And what's happened is, I guess, the moving away from those natural and highly evolved sort of processes and putting in this cheap feed means that those animals are not necessarily as healthy as they could be. So just the same as humans who, we've evolved to eat a certain amount of food. And if you look at what's happening in the population at the moment, there's clearly much higher levels of obesity, much higher levels of inflammation. And I think that's kind of, it's not a long way to go between drawing those parallels between the incidence of human health and obesity and these sort of poor biomarkers that we see in the populations now, and some of the problems that we see in factory farmed meat, right? So I think typically what you would say is that factory farmed or industrialized farming, the outputs of those animals will have higher incidence of issues, whether it's inflammatory markers, whether it's just those, the balance of omega-3s and omega-6s. But also, we see higher levels of antibiotics required for those animals because there is such an issue with the types of food that they're eating and obviously the health outcomes that those animals are experiencing. And so again, to draw those parallels between, I guess, humans and what we're eating and the animals that are going through a vastly changed food system. I think that's the easiest way for me to look at it and to think about it is that, animals have evolved to eat a certain amount of grass and they do a really amazing job at converting that into a high protein, nutrient dense product being beef. And what's happening is that unfortunately we're just, again, we're interacting and we're intervening and we're coming in and saying, well, you know what, we've got corn, we've got all these grains, let's just feed them those because, in the case of the US, it's a highly subsidized commodity and that farmers can get it cheaply, and so let's just feed them that. And I think that the ultimate, the outcome that we see is that the animal's health is impaired, I think, and that's flowing through into our food system.
Yeah, that makes sense. And my question is, and I don't know this myself, are only cattle farms regenerative farms or are there any other?
No, I think what we see is that a lot of farmers are using all sorts of different whether they be animals or whether they be plants, to actually create valuable commodities for consumption, right? So, we've seen people using chickens, and they have a really unique way of interacting with the environment that a ruminant can't, right? So, they're going to pick and feed at the bugs and the microbes, and then they're going to leave their own sort of nutrient dense droppings on the ground, and that's going to be gone back into the soil, and higher levels of nitrogen, which we find through their excrement. So you can do a whole heap of different things. There's obviously entities like polyphased farms and these types of places that actually have a really diverse number and types of products which are they're creating, right? So I think you don't need to just be focused on beef. I think what we're seeing is even the ability to utilize cover crops in regenerative programs. Those cover crops, which work really well to add nutrients back into the soil, still have a value, right? So whether it's lupin or one of these types of cover crops, hemp, another good cover crop, growing those cover crops actually still creates a valuable commodity at the end of it. And so, no, I don't think it's just beef. It's anything can really be, again, adding back into that environment. If we use that as the sort of the basis or the definition of regen ag, it's anything that can actually improve that environment and the outcomes for the local environment. So no, I think it's a much more wide ranging than just using animals.
Yeah, that's interesting, because people usually think that cows are bad for the environment, and they actually help to improve the environment. So I just want to point that out. But I've got a question. What is the difference, if any, between regenerative and organic farm?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think this is it's an important distinction. And look, both have their positives, right? I think what you look at is organics is great, and it creates a set of metrics and elements that need to be met, and is kind of a little bit, I would say it's process driven, right? So you need to go through a process of checks and balances to ensure that you can reach the standards met by organics. And some of those are fantastic, right? Like, we obviously use organic beef. One of the main reasons that we use organic beef is because soil testing needs to be done on that organic land 4 years before the organic certification is reached, and that soil testing ensures that there's no harmful pesticides or herbicides that are found on that land or in that soil. And so for us, when we're looking at that, that's obviously increasingly important, because we can guarantee that there's no glyphosate or none of those sort of harmful pesticides that will end up in the food that we produce. But it's a very process driven essentially a system, right? What regeneratively agriculture looks at is more of an outcomes-based approach, right? So, you can look at the ways in which we're improving an environment through different metrics. So, not that we necessarily want to be completely carbon focused, but we can look at the level of carbon sequestration which is happening on that land. And so for us, it's about how do we juggle both of those certifications to a certain extent, right? So yes, we want organic certification. It's not the be all and end all for us. We think it's great. It has its challenges. I think one of the challenges that organics has is that it's an expensive process for a farmer to undertake. And so it limits, I guess for us, it limits the amount of farmers that we can work with, because they need to be at a certain scale to be able to afford the organic certification. And so when we look at regen, conversely, whilst there are a number of different sort of marks out there, being land to market is one that have some really interesting sort of regenerative certification. again, it's a little bit different. It's a more outcomes based. So we can look at some of those markers, again, whether it's carbon, whether it's water use, whether it's land transformation, biodiversity markers, some of these other elements that we can look at and measure, and we can say, well, great, like a regenerative system has had an increase in biodiversity in that environment over X period of time. And so they are a little bit different, although there are clearly some overlapping areas and fundamentals there. But ultimately, for us, organics is an interesting system, because I think at the moment, within a consumer's understanding, organics is very, very high. And so it carries, I guess, some value for our consumers to understand that the beef is raised in an organic environment. And so, for us, it's not the be all and end all, but I think at the moment, with consumers' understanding, and we're hoping to change that. Obviously, that's part of our goal is to further and to amplify the message of regenerative agriculture. Over time, we hope that we can carry both a regenerative, whether it be a certification, or be able to speak to consumers more about the power of regenerative agriculture and the reasons why they should care about it.
Yeah, great. So if we had to sum up this whole cluster of questions, if you had to use only a few sentences, how is regenerative farming beneficial to the planet, the human health, and the product quality? Just a quick recap.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's once you go down this rabbit hole, I think this is something that I've certainly lived, but once you go down this rabbit hole of understanding regen ag, and you sort of have a base level of education, it's really clear to see the way in which this is better for not only for the environment, but clearly for human health as well. And so for me, it's about a return to a very, very old way of farming and the increase of nutrient density of the produce which can be created. And so for me, that's it. If you have a better environment, and clearly regenerative agriculture improves the environment, it's very easy to see how the output of that environment will be better for our own consumption. So that's the thing for me, is a healthier environment. Our friend Charlie Arnott, right? He always says, if you know the name of your farmer, you're probably not going to need to know the name of your doctor. And that's because of the clear health impacts and outcomes that you can achieve if you actually put the thought and time into sourcing products out of a regenerative system.
Yeah. Thank you. That's great. So now I have the second part of questions, which are called the rookie questions. And it's just since you mentioned Charlie, when you and Charlie talk, you use a lot of terms that most people have no idea what you're talking about. And sometimes I don't even know what you're talking about. And because I have to reveal that we are having Charlie on the podcast talking about more advanced regenerative farming stuff, I think we need to clarify some of the terms first. So let's start with explaining to us what is carbon sequestration and how does it work?
So, yeah, look, really simply, carbon sequestration is the returning of atmospheric carbon, so CO2, carbon dioxide, into plant matter and biomass, right, into the soil. So we all know plants and trees obviously breathe in carbon dioxide, they give off oxygen, but where that carbon goes is actually into their biomass, right? So into, whether it be their root system or whether it go into the trunk of the tree, whatever, that goes, it's kind of the what gives that tree its structure, right? And so sequestration is essentially just that natural process by which carbon is taken out of the atmosphere in the form of CO2 and is put into the soil or put into the plant matter in the form of carbon, essentially carbon dioxide.
Okay, amazing. Okay. Now, the second question that I need this explanation, because I hear you talking about terms like rotational grazing, AMP grazing, holistic plant management. Do they all mean the same thing, or is it something different, and what is it?
Yeah, I mean, there's crossover between them. They're kind of similar terms for slightly different things. Essentially, it goes around this idea of rather than just having one big paddock where all of the animals are, and they sort of essentially try and they will overgraze an area, right? And so what that means is that they will eat the grass down to its bare root or down to bare dirt, right? And what happens is that if you overgraze an area like that, or if the cows are left to overgraze an area, it won't regenerate or it won't grow very quickly, right? So the idea, and if you look at whether it be AMP, which is just adaptive multi-paddock, or whether you look at sort of holistic planning, or if you look at any one of the ways that you define it, rotational grazing, the idea is that you have much smaller segments of land, so much smaller paddocks or areas or cells, and the animals are moved on a more rapid or high frequency basis, right? So it means that the animals don't get the chance to overgraze a particular area. They're moved from cell to cell on a daily basis, often, and then that small paddock is allowed to rest for a long period of time, over 30 days in some instances. So it allows for, again, essentially just more sequestration of carbon in the soil. So because that grass has not been overgrazed and more of that grass sort of exists, when it's allowed to rest and it's given the time to kind of regenerate, essentially, it's able to pull more carbon from the atmosphere and put that into the soil structure. And so all of those areas, in talking about rotational grazing or AMP or anything like that, all of those practices look at higher frequency of movement of those animals and the allowance of time for essentially for that paddock to recover and to sequester more carbon. And so that's the idea behind those philosophies.
Okay, that makes sense. Next question I really have to ask, because you can see it a lot on social media and people really sometimes get very passionate about it. Do cows burp methane, and is it really a problem?
Well, yes, they do. They do burp methane. Is it a problem? Well, I mean, I think, it is part of the natural, what we call the biogenic sort of carbon system or carbon cycle. And so, what actually happens is that it does, the cow burps, methane comes out, that methane is essentially converted into carbon dioxide. It goes through this sort of 12-year cycle where it's essentially turned into CO2. It is obviously a harmful greenhouse gas, and we want to, I guess, eliminate it as much as possible. I guess the way that we need to also think about it is that what are the other areas that we need to focus on, and how can the environment that the cow or the ruminant is on, how can we make sure that that environment is allowed to then regenerate and draw that carbon out of the soil, out of the atmosphere, and put it back into the soil. And so that's the challenge, I think, that we see and is often overlooked when we talk about, cows are killing the environment. Well, it's not that simple, right? So if we look at the amount of what's being created, where it's being created, the different environments are vastly contrast, right? So when we look at what's happening in, say, South America, it's not just about the burping of the cow, it's the fact that, okay, the cow is grazing on land which has been cleared from a natural forest. It's industrialized methodologies are being used there. So not only is the cow burping, but the cow, all the excrement of the cow is just being piled up It's not being properly dispersed across the atmosphere, across the landscape. It's not being utilized as a fertilizer. And so what you see not just the methane from the cow, but it's also the fact that the environment which is being cleared to house that cow is being cleared from natural forest. The manure is piling up. That's leading to huge levels of methane as well. And the fact that the soil can't actually absorb any of that ultimate CO2 that comes through that biogenic carbon cycle means that there's a huge increase in the methane and CO2 that animal is essentially contributing to. What we look at when we talk about regen is we say, well, okay, yes, there is a biogenic carbon cycle, methane is being created, but what can happen is that once that methane goes in, is converted to CO2, it can be drawn back into the soil quite easily. And so that's what we're more worried about, is by demonizing cows, by demonizing meat in general, it overlooks a lot of these components, right? And so what we want to talk about is, it's not the cow, it's the how, right? Like, what are the things that we can actually do? Because ruminants have been part of our environment for, millions of years. So let's not say, well, all cows are bad, we just have to stop farming. It's a little bit myopic, and I don't think it gets to the heart of the problem. What we need to look at is the ways in which we can increase the soil or the land's ability to also deal with carbon, right? And so that's the sort of thing that we need to spend a little bit more time looking at and talking about, rather than just sort of demonizing one element, right? Because I think if you talk about just one element, I think it's a much more complex area, right? Even if we were to look at plants and we're looking at vegetables, the amount of land which is being cleared to plant monocrops in different areas, right? That still occurs, but no one vilifies plant-based nutrition. And so we need to look at these complex agricultural and food systems in more detail, rather than just being, paint or tar everyone with the same brush.
Yeah, that's true. I'm talking about the trees as well that you mentioned before. Do we actually need to cut down the trees to graze cows, as you said they do in Argentina, or you don't have to?
No, of course not. No, absolutely not. I think, certainly for the beef that we have access to and we largely use in the chief products, right? That is in arid and semi-arid environments, right? So there's been no trees cleared whatsoever to use that environment, and we largely graze on natural grasses, saltbush, these types of things in the environment, right? So it's not about having to clear it, and I think that's definitely what we want to avoid. And I think one of the arguments that that people who demonize beef sort of talk about is that, well, if there should be vegetables grown on that land rather than animals, right? And I think that argument falls down when you look at the ability for ruminants to graze in arid and semi-arid locations, right? And certainly that's one of the advantages that we have here in Australia, is that we have a multitude of different environments in which ruminants can thrive. And so that's the thing that we want to look at. We would much rather have very, very low levels of land transformation. It doesn't make sense for us to clear large portions of the Amazon, right, which are the lungs of the planet, the area that can filter as much carbon or more carbon than anywhere else on the world. It doesn't make any sense for us to be clearing that. But what we need to be able to look at is different environments in which ruminants can live and can thrive, where we don't need to clear that forest, right? I think that's where we should be looking. But unfortunately, that's the problem that we live in, is with the industrialized food system that is happening, and we want to move away from that however we can.
Yeah, 100%. One last question about the cows. So the people that demonize the beef and beef industry, they also complain about cows using lots of water. Can you clarify that?
Yeah, and that goes again to that sort of that piece on if you're using an industrialized method where the cows are not grazing on open pasture where it's relying on the natural fall of rain. That's the way that it's calculated. So there's a little bit of there's a few problems with that argument, right? One is that the way that it is calculated is very misleading, right? So the way that it would be calculated is if there is 1 cow per acre on a block of land, and that acre receives, I don't know, whatever it is, 120 millimeters of rain in a period of time, all of that rain which has fallen on that land is attributed to that 1 cow. Now, the rain is going to fall regardless of whether the cow is there or not, and the cow is not utilizing all of that water. So that's going into green water, right? So it can be really misleading the way in which those calculations are created. So that's the first thing that you need to worry about. And I think the other part of it is the way that you can look at these different for us, like for example, we've done full life cycle assessment and analysis on our products, right? And one of the crazy things that we found through that, especially with the beef bar, right, was that a huge proportion of our water usage in that product actually came from the small amount of cranberries that we used, right? So I think 74% of our total water usage in a beef bar came from cranberries, and that was the fact that they have to flood the fields to harvest the cranberries. And so for us, we look at that again, using the data as a weapon for us, really, and being able to say, great, well, how can we make changes and how can we swap that out? And so that was why I think it was about a year or 18 months ago that we swapped out cranberries for currants and have, dramatically saved the amount of water which is required to create each of our bars. So look, I think it's a little bit, again, there's a lot of detail that you need to go into rather than just looking at these sort of headlines that are often sort of brought out and sort of say, cows use X amount of water. It's really, really misleading and suits the narrative of people who are trying to demonize meat. But unfortunately, it's not really well founded. And I think, again, there's a lot more nuance in that rather than just the headline.
Yeah. Okay, guys, if you tuned out, remember, don't eat cranberries, eat beef. Uses less water. Anyway, one last rookie question before we move on to something else. What is greenwashing?
So, I mean, look, greenwashing is essentially just the use, I guess, of green initiatives for a marketing outcome, which I think it's important that people have more awareness around the environment, but I think it can get lost when people try and use statistics in a misleading way. And to misrepresent the business. And I think that's essentially what greenwashing is. And I think we're at a really pivotal time, right, in terms of making sure that consumers really understand. I think that's what we're trying to do here, right, is to inform consumers and advance some of the really important farming methodologies rather than just sort of using these slogans for the betterment of sales outcomes, right? And so, yeah, greenwashing is essentially just the utilization of these buzzwords or terms to try and make a business or product look better than it actually is.
Okay, great. So now that we know all the terms and basics, let's move on to some of the controversies. I just want to point out this is not necessarily my opinion, but those are the things that I'm hearing out there. So number one, is there enough science backing the benefits of regenerative farming? There are some skeptics pointing out that more scientific research is needed to validate the long-term benefits and also the feasibility of regenerative farming.
Yeah, so I mean, look, I think as a general rule, I think more scientific research on everything should be great. And I think we need to be continuing to look at validation of these. But I think the amount of time that has gone past and the impact that we see on environments, if you wanted to go back to, when Alan Savory was sort of tracking the impacts that he was having and the positive outcomes that he was seeing in using these farming methodologies, it's quite clear that they're to the betterment of the environment. I don't think you just need to look at them basically and get on farm or talk to a farmer who has done and utilized these methodologies, and it's you don't need to look too much further than their stories and what they've been able to create, and the positive impacts and the biomarkers that they see, that's been fantastic for them. So look, I think it would always be great to look at the benefit and the feasibility of these types of things, but I think in the instance of regen, it's really, really clear that its benefit is there, and that we need to harness it more and more.
100%. It's pretty straightforward. I just wanted to clarify it for the others. Critics also argue that the regenerative farming can be less economically viable, particularly in the short term, as it often requires changes in the farm management and infrastructure. What is your stance on it?
Yeah, so, I mean, talking to farmers, one of the biggest impacts on their profitability is actually through the mitigation or less resilience on external inputs, right? And so what I mean by that is that these farmers no longer need to buy, the synthetic NPKs, or they don't need to buy the different fungicides and herbicides and pesticides and been putting all of these things onto their land, right? And so whilst there can be a transition period, and that's understandable through any farming methodology or paradigm, there's what they see from a profitability standpoint is that over the long term, these are far more profitable environments that they're creating, because if you look at essentially just the inputs and the outputs, or the profit and loss, if you look at it from an accounting perspective, it's much easier for them to get a positive outcome or profit at the bottom if they don't have all of these input costs, right? So they're not having to spray, on a daily or weekly basis. They don't have all of these machinery costs because they're no longer plowing the fields. There's a lot less input costs. So look, every farm is different, and it'd be silly for me to try and say that all farms are always going to be more profitable by using regenerative agriculture. But what I think we've seen anecdotally, and certainly through the guys that we speak to, and is that it's a much better way, it's a much easier process to create profit out of the bottom, because of not only the reduction in those input costs, but potentially an increased yield as well, through not just their primary output. So whether that be, if they're beef farmers, definitely, obviously they might be able to produce more beef, but the impact on the environment is so much greater. It's in such a more positive lens that I think that ultimately it's much better for them as a farming community to be able to use these methodologies.
Yeah, that's great. But what about the scalability? Is it actually scalable to a large scale commercial farming?
So I think this is, probably misunderstood. Largely, I don't believe that regen is designed to be like factory farming, right? Like the whole reason and the way that we got into this mess is that we had to try and scale these farms, right? And it's like, oh, well, we don't have enough grass to feed them, so what should we give them? Oh, let's just give them grain, right? Like regen isn't necessarily about scaling, although we've seen some, decent sized and scaled businesses. Certainly White Oak Pastures in the US is kind of the guiding light to what they've been able to achieve. But what regen is it's replicatable. So it's not about let's get these massive companies to all of a sudden just switch over industrial and into regen. It's not about that necessarily. It's more about how can we replicate these systems in a whole array of different environments. Like I said, whether that's in an arid environment, a semi-arid environment, whether that's in Australia, whether that's in the US, how can we create these environments which can be replicated and in total are benefiting the environment. So I don't think we'll necessarily be able to, in 20 years' time, be able to sort of say, oh, well, we've been able to scale regen, isn't that great? I don't think that's necessarily should be the goal. What we should be able to try and do is increase the amount of regen products and scale the output. But I think what will happen is that that will happen across a multitude of smaller operations rather than it being dominated by a number of really large-scale operators.
Okay. So hypothetically, could you see the world that cancels all the factory farms and everyone only eats regeneratively farmed meat, considering how many people there are on the planet?
I mean, I'd love to. I don't think that's necessarily in our human nature to go that way. I think there will always be people who are trying to create a cheaper commodity. And I think that's just human nature, right? So if we said that, regen beef maybe costs a little bit more, is everyone going to start, paying more for it? Well, I don't think so. I think what we'll see is we'll always see in a commoditized market, we'll see a race to the bottom in terms of price. And so I don't think, whilst I love the idea of this utopian world of everyone farming in a regen way, I can't actually see that happening, not because of the methodologies of regen, but just because of human nature and the way in which commoditized operations work, right? So yes, I'd love to. I'd love to be able to say I see that, and I think that's really possible. I think what's more likely and what we need to be looking at is how do we just increase that amount of regen farmed beef, in our case, how do we promote that? How do we educate consumers around it? And how do we shift the needle incrementally in terms of the adoption of those outputs, right? So how can we get more people looking at it and voting with their dollar around the products that they're choosing, right? And so that's the big thing that we want to look at. How can we advance that recognition within consumers that regen is better and that they're going to vote with their dollar and choose a regeneratively created and farmed product?
100%. It certainly is better. And I always say to my clients as a nutritionist that if they eat the proper amount of meat and they don't binge and overeat, it's going to actually cost them the same when they buy the regeneratively farmed meat.
Yeah,
As
absolutely.
if they buy the factory farmed meat. Because even like I finished uni almost 20 years ago, and even back then they're telling us that Westerners overeat on processed meats by 4 times. That's what they should. And if everyone ate just normal portions, we could all actually eat organic, regeneratively farmed meat.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe education is one of the big one there as well.
For sure.
Anyways, I want to ask for everyone here, what does carbon neutral mean? Why is it important? And is regenerative farming carbon neutral?
Yeah, so carbon neutral is essentially just the balance of I guess the amount of carbon which is put into the atmosphere through the process versus the amount of carbon which is sequestered, right? So being neutral on that, the inputs or what you're producing is same as the amount that you're able to sequester. So the challenge with that term is that there have been ways in which people can sort of game the system, right? And so that's typically been by using carbon credits, right? So it's, company A produces this product, it uses X amount of carbon to create that product. And what they'll do is they'll just buy carbon credits to offset essentially the amount of carbon that it has taken to create that product. I think the challenge is that buying carbon credits shouldn't and doesn't necessarily absolve you of your responsibility, right? So,
What do you mean they buy carbon credits? So they pretty much just pay for producing carbon?
Yeah, exactly. So it's supposed to be part of this carbon system where farmers or people can create ways or carbon sinks, and they are essentially creating carbon credits, right? So I think the challenge has been that there's not necessarily a lot of transparency around where that goes, right? So is that carbon credit really being created? How do we know that what are the checks and balances that have been undertaken to make sure that that carbon credit is actually being created? It's a little bit it's a little bit of a black hole there, I think. And so, in the terms of, whether it be farming or whether it be, travel, right? So you can now tick a box when you're booking a flight and you say, oh, I want to offset my flight and I'll pay a little bit more, and you'll buy the carbon credits, right? I think the interesting thing that farming has is that it has the direct ability to essentially be carbon negative, right? Which means that it's capturing more carbon than it's creating. And that's an amazing opportunity, right? That this system has that few others do, and so that's what we want to look at. Is that, and you and I visited a few farms. I know one that we went to, Macca's up near Newcastle, near Gloucester. They've been able to do the testing themselves to understand that the amount of methane and CO2 that the cows are producing, and all of their other farm equipment, everything else that goes into the running and the production of that facility, they're sequestering more carbon than they're producing, right? So that's actually carbon negative. So they're not using offsets. They're not paying money to just, hope that the problem goes away and absolving themselves of responsibility. What they're actually doing is that they're, through their land management and through the opportunities that they have with grass-fed beef, is that they're actually sequestering more carbon than they're putting out. And so that's the sort of holy grail that we sort of want to get to, right? Is that if we can make sure that we're actually sequestering that carbon, and it's not just being put into some sink somewhere that may or may not get dug up in 2 or 5 years' time. We know that not only would our product be carbon neutral, but it might be actually carbon negative. That's what we're sort of striving for.
That's amazing. So here you go, guys. Lots of people here will be shocked that cows actually help to improve environment and not destroy it. And I'm glad that we learned that today. And I have last 2 questions that might and might not be related to regen farming. I want to know, what is your favorite book and why? And if you could give only one health and fitness advice to our listeners, what would that be?
Good questions. In terms of the regen side of things, I mean, look, for people who want more, I think that one of the books that really got me onto this topic was a book by Charles Massey called The Call of the Reed Warbler. I think it's sort of essential listening for anyone to understand a little bit more around regen ag. I think it's a great sort of first step. There's a couple of other books on that topic. One by Will Harris, who runs White Oak Pastures in Georgia, America. It's called A Bold Return to Giving a Damn. That's a fantastic book and a fantastic listen for those who listen to audiobooks. He's got an amazing sort of southern Georgian accent, which makes listening to it pretty fun. And there's a couple of others. I'd say For the Love of Soil is a great one from Nicole Masters. Goes into a lot more detail around agronomy and the use of soil structures. And so that's if you're after something a little bit more detailed. So they're definitely a good read. In terms of health and fitness advice, I think, well, you and I are of a similar vintage, right? And I think one of the things that happens when you start to get a little bit older is that you have the ability to maybe make excuses for training and doing these types of things. And one of the things that I've been really mindful on is making sure that I don't use an excuse of getting older to stop training. And, I want to be, still training and still lifting and still being able to do these sorts of things when I'm 80, 90, 100 years old, hopefully, right? And so that's the biggest thing for me, is just don't stop. Don't let age be a determining factor. It's only a number. You've got to keep going. And I think in terms of creating longevity within a life and creating health span rather than just a lifespan, I think it's really, really important. So yeah, just don't stop. Just keep going.
Yeah, I love
after
it. And I also love that you say as you preach, because I can tell to all our listeners that you are very inspirational. You do run the company, you do have 3 kids, you help your wife with the kids, and you still manage to train, you do your fasting, you eat healthily. So when I hear anyone telling me any excuses, I have family, I'm older, I'm this and that, I'm like, no, Brock can do it, you can do it too. So thanks for being
Thanks,
our inspiration, and thanks for coming on today. And
Thanks,
I can't wait for your podcast with Charlie.
That'd be great. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening. Let us know in the comments below what topics interest you, and don't forget to follow us.